All right. Thanks everyone for joining. As the slide says here, this talk is about decoupled CMS architecture in government as a best practice. And just to give a bit of an overview, it's less about the implementation details and more how to think about the various pieces and what this means from a management standpoint. Over the last couple of years, there's some aspects to decoupled that I think are taken for granted and are not generally thought of when as in context to government. So let's get started. Slide about me. I'm a senior software engineer at Amazy.io. And to give a bit of background, one of the first websites I built was for the Air Force in 1998. So I've been doing this for a little while. And prior to my current role at Amazy, I worked with New York State and was in charge of a team that managed roughly 60 government sites. And I've been working with Drupal for roughly 15 years, and I founded and managed a few different agencies that specialized in Drupal. And I've worked extensively with API-first Drupal implementations and front-end frameworks. So here's the agenda for this talk. First, I'll talk about some government challenges, and then we'll go over a proposed solution, and then proposed or some potential results, followed by some risks and concerns, hosting and deployment, and where we can go from here. And then there should be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. All right, so what's the problem? Drupal is complex. It's hard to learn. It's complicated to deploy and scale, and traditional Drupal development requires a large knowledge base. So throw on top of that, government has a unique set of challenges, and let's go through some of those challenges. Resource allocation. How do government agencies best utilize the resources they have? How can you reduce your reliance on senior full stack engineers? We used to call them the purple squirrel because they don't really exist. It's just too much information for any one developer or to really manage and grasp completely. So how do you best utilize the resources that you have? How do you train and develop these skill sets so that they have longevity? You want to develop skill sets on your team to have longevity, and ultimately, how can that tooling impact the overall growth of the team? And what's the best way to build a junior to senior pipeline? Open source community is always a big issue in government, especially. How can you take advantage of that larger open source community? This generally means more access to help when needed, better access to resources, training materials. And project velocity and quality is a big concern, or a big government challenge as well. How can you increase velocity? How can you improve quality? Hosting and scaling is a concern or an issue in government as well. How do you manage scaling and high demand events? And then budget constraints. I mean, this isn't unique to government projects alone, obviously, but how do you manage and reduce costs? The fact remains that full stack senior engineers are hard to find, they're hard to train, and they're really expensive. So what's the solution? I would say that the solution here is let's use Drupal for its strengths. Let's leverage front-end frameworks via an API, and let's deploy via containerized hosting if possible. Let's dive into these a little bit more. So what are some of Drupal's strengths? Well, Drupal is really good at complex role-based authoring. It's really good at role-based management systems. It's really good with working with large authenticated user bases. It's Also really good at data architecture and data modeling. Drupal's great at configuration management and security. The security team at Drupal is fantastic. And it's really good at dealing with complex integrations, bringing in data sources from a bunch of different places. The next piece of the solution I would propose is treating Drupal as an API first. Expose your content as a public API, and this can be done via tools like GraphQL. It can be done with JSON API. Doesn't really matter there. And then leveraging front-end frameworks, extremely popular front-end frameworks like React, Vue, or Angular. Again, from my perspective, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the skill set that your team has, or the specific framework that your team is interested in adopting. And then finally, I'll get into this a little bit more later, but containerized development and hosting can dramatically improve things, as well as testing. So let's see. Tools like Lando and Lagoon can help here as well. So decoupled for the win. I mainly propose a fully decoupled approach versus a progressively decoupling some pages or components if possible. I tend to look at progressively decoupled projects as a bit harder to manage and generally just a bit messier. So let's talk about why this is a win. What are the benefits? First, when you separate out the component pieces of a system, each piece of that system can be better managed, it can be better trained, scaled, tested, and swapped out as necessary. And I think you can look at this from two kind of different sides of the same coin here. So the first side is, why is this a win from a team perspective? Well, first, it promotes skill set specialization. The need to understand the entire stack is less, as your team members can focus on specific areas of need. And this allows you to break up your team into different pieces, a mobile team, a web team, a front-end team, a back-end team, etc. And so along those lines, scaling the team is much easier. So it, again, decreases that need for the senior full stack developer. And, HTML, CSS, JavaScript are pretty standard web designer developer skills. And the more junior, from my experience, the more junior you can keep your team, the easier it is to grow and scale. And it's much easier to add additional front-end or back-end developers as needed. And it promotes that divide and conquer style of development, which can be a big win. Training the team is much easier. Without the need to understand the entire stack, you can focus on just learning what's needed. And site building and standard front-end work can be accomplished with a more junior staff traditionally. So leaving just the more complicated business requirements and customization to the senior members. The other side of this coin is what are the technical benefits? What are the technical wins here? Well, a decoupled approach is a lot more future compatible. We can leverage this huge community, global communities, around a React and Angular for support, documentation, security. These communities are massive, and the more we can leverage them, the better. There was a big movement to get off the Drupal island for a while, and there's reasons why that's a huge win. Not just from the reasons I mentioned, but also those skill sets now become accessible to your team. So you can find these new developers to scale your team a lot easier than you can find a full stack Drupal developer. So it can benefit you there as well. Front-end frameworks are also heavily supported and sponsored by organizations like Google and Facebook, and they're not going to be going out of business anytime soon. It's also future compatible because it creates this front-end independence. The data and content tends to change a lot less frequently than the front end look and feel will. You might go through several iterations of how your site looks, so you can swap that out. On the other side of that, upgrading the CMS or potentially even swapping it out at some point can be done without affecting that presentation layer. So it gives you some options as far as where where things move in the future. Now, scaling the infrastructure is also a lot more straightforward. You're less reliant on massive server resources for complicated page builds like you would with a traditional Drupal implementation. Front-end caching is generally easier to handle on via CDNs, things like places like Fastly, and testing is generally more efficient from my experience, as you can separate out your front end and your back end tests. So leveraging JavaScript testing tools like Jest or Cypress.io can ultimately help harden your project against regressions, independent of that back-end API. That being said, the API can just as easily be tested independently as well. This can be built into your CI process. It should be built into your CI process if possible, which greatly improves the overall quality of the final product. And, the last piece here, I guess I have another one below that, but local development is a huge win as well. Leveraging containers creates a really lean approach to local server needs, and data can be mocked via JSON files while the site's being built. This can dramatically speed the front-end development process. And the tooling around many of these front-end frameworks is fantastic. React has built-in Chrome widgets, or I think Angular does as well. I'm not entirely sure about Vue, but it probably does too, where you can inspect the state of your application at any given time. Another big win is the architectural opportunities that you have when you decouple. It gives you the opportunity to deploy the front end completely independent of the back end, and you could implement your decoupled project in different Git repositories, which would give more flexibility in how teams work independently. Who should have access to the front end Git repo, who should have access to the back end Git repo. And it also creates opportunities to consume that data on other platforms like mobile apps or Alexa or Internet of Things devices. From a programming standpoint, it's also that clearer separation of concerns. And the more you can do that, the easier it is to manage, and a number of other benefits in that area. So you also have this potential for improved performance. Some sites that are decoupled can be incredibly fast, and that helps from a usability standpoint, and ultimately in conversions if you get into that side of the world. So there are a lot of benefits to decoupling a project. All right, so let's dive into what some of the risks and concerns are, though, because it's not all puppy dogs and rainbows. And so you've got ecosystem maturity as a concern. Drupal and front-end frameworks are still relatively new. Some things are just not baked in when you start teasing apart Drupal in this way. SEO is one that comes to mind, accessibility, forms, and handling form input, cross-site server scripting issues. Some of that isn't just baked in. So, fear of change is another big concern. Many teams are familiar with that monolithic Drupal approach to building sites, and there's this perception that now I have to learn an entirely new set of skills. And I would say there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. It's a trade-off rather. It's, you have PHP and Twig for the theming layer versus Node.js, JavaScript, and one of these front-end frameworks. And along those lines, you've got increased technology stack, and decoupled can seem really scary at first for a lot of teams. It seems like there's a lot of new things to learn, wrap your head around. And again, I'd argue this is somewhat of an unfair perception and more of a trade-off. You have nuances of the theme, hooks, custom modules, et cetera, versus understanding the nuances of a front-end framework. And this is sort of a reoccurring theme in this talk, is that one of the unspoken benefits of getting off of that Drupal island are your skill sets that you're developing in these front-end frameworks translate much further than just the Drupal ecosystem, and that has huge value. Cross-team communication is another big concern here. This approach promotes that separation of teams, and the various teams need to communicate together on needs and business requirements pretty regularly. Project managers become critically important to organize tasks and sprints, and accessibility is another big concern. At the end of the day, it's all just semantic HTML. You deal with the same issues in a decoupled front-end framework that you would in a custom theme for the most part. Now, with custom themes, you might sub-theme and get some of that accessibility baked in. But as you're building out custom components, you still have to write semantic accessible HTML, and you have to do the same thing in a decoupled front-end framework. So it is really just a one versus the other there. There are also some amazing tools out there like Storybook, which we've standardized on at Amazy, which can help with accessibility. There's some built-in widgets that do accessibility checks. And if you're not familiar with Storybook, I'd highly recommend checking that out. SEO, SSR, and caching. So search engine optimization, server-side rendering, and caching. To handle SEO well, you probably would want to use a Node.js server to pre-render your pages using something like Next.js or Gatsby. And this presents some challenges, especially with things like URL aliases and metadata, which has traditionally been handled on the Drupal side of things. And if you still need that editorial control over those pieces, there needs to be some standardized rules and a mapping that needs to happen between the back end and the front end, and how that gets transferred over to the front end. Not at all insurmountable, but it is something that can be a bit challenging. And caching can be handled in several different layers. Obviously, the varnish on the Drupal side of things, and then CDNs for the rendered Node.js and Next.js side of things. And let's get into hosting as well as a risk or concern, because many of the traditional hosting providers don't support adding additional servers as needed, like Node.js. So there may be some issues there to consider. And finally, technical leadership is definitely a risk and concern. There are a lot of moving parts here, and your team, will definitely need to have some technical leadership still to tie the various pieces together. And from my experience, you're going to need a lot fewer senior technical engineers than you would with a traditional large-scale Drupal implementation, but you still will need that technical leadership. All right, from here, let's talk a little bit more about development, testing, hosting, and deployment. And so containers. This is where containers can really shine from a development perspective. Anyone can run the whole stack on their computer without installing individual components, individual, like a LAMP stack. All you do is clone the repository, run Docker Compose up, and you have everything you need locally. Unlike something like Dev Desktop or MAMP or WAMP, which traditionally developers would use, but it makes it very difficult to extend and doesn't mirror the production environment. When you have two different teams, let's say a front end and a back end team with different infrastructure and tooling, at some point you will need to run the entire Drupal site locally. And containers are great here because you can just spin up the necessary stack. The front end team doesn't need to know anything about the back end team and the back end system, and the back end team doesn't need to know anything about the front end system. From a testing standpoint, again, testing is dramatically improved in a containerized environment because the backend team can test the API independently of the front end and vice versa. And full end-to-end tests can be run via platforms like Cypress, and that can help ensure the business requirements. So from a hosting and deployment standpoint, the containers you run locally are exactly the same that you run on production. And this really can't be understated. There's no more dealing with, a minor PHP version getting swapped out from under you, causing, hard to trace bugs. And, this is where, hosting providers like Lagoon can definitely shine. So, where to go next? I encourage you to give it a shot. I also wanted to present a couple of projects that were brought to my attention recently that I think do a fantastic job of demonstrating decoupled. I do think there's a need for more starter kits in this space, especially with Drupal. And I would encourage the community to really dive into this. But this is a great example of connecting Drupal and Vue. And they have the umami theme done in Vue, and they've got their repository available for anybody to use. And this is also running on Lagoon currently. So I'd encourage anybody to check out Druxt. It's pretty fantastic, and definitely give Amazy.io an email if you have any questions on the cloud or hosting side of things. So with that, that's pretty much my talk. I wanted to leave some room for Q&A, and I probably breezed through my slides a little faster than I did in my prep, but I just wanted to give a high-level overview of what some of those best practices are, and to end with just a little bit of my own experience here. In working with teams on decoupled projects, I found that it really brought kind of an energy to a project when we started to bring in some of these decoupled tools. React, we standardized on React for the most part, and bringing those junior developers on the team into React, it was just much easier for them to digest versus the entire Drupal ecosystem. Drupal can be kind of a massive thing to wrap your brain around. So,
looks like we have one question over here. What was the front end to the Druxt.js project?
Yeah, the Druxt.js, I believe, is using Vue.js.
Vue's good. We just rolled out an application for USDA using Vue.
Yeah, Vue is fantastic. It has that two-way data binding that I really like as well. But yeah, any other questions, feel free to shoot them.
Are you going to upload your slides on the GovCon website, or have them available somewhere else?
Sure, I can upload them to the GovCon website, no problem.
Great, okay.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
Cool. Well, I hope this talk was useful and kind of presented the landscape and just gave my ideas on why I think the decoupled space is um, a best practice, especially in government. I think it's from a management standpoint, it can definitely